Everybody, Mr. Barker here. I just wanted to quickly go over with you all how to properly write out your answers in CSRQ format, and I figured the best way to show you would be to go ahead and go over the very first question that we're going to be writing out in CSRQ format for this year. So it'll be the very first question in our Through the Tunnel reading guide, the reading guide that's on my screen, and it should be the same reading guide that you guys are about to start working with here in a moment. So let's look at the first question. Then we'll look at the story, and then we will talk about what the answer might possibly be, and then how we'll go about writing that out in CSRQ format. And remember, from the previous slide that you should have watched, or you should have viewed, CSRQ simply stands for Complete Sentence Restate the Question. So let's get to it. The very first question, it says, reread the very first paragraph of the story. What contrast, which means difference, exists between the beach and the bay? So if we jump over here to the story, and we look at the very first paragraph, if you've read through it a few times, you notice that Jerry, the main character, he describes the beach and the bay two different times in this very first paragraph. The first time is right here, where he says, looked down at a wild and rocky bay, then over to the crowded beach he knew well from other years. So that's the first time he describes the beach and the bay. He describes the bay as wild, as rocky. Then he goes on to describe the beach as something he's familiar with. He says he knew it so well from other years. So once again, the first description he's given us, he describes the bay as wild and rocky, and he describes the beach as something he's known well from other years. He's familiar with it. And then from rereading that paragraph, you should have seen that down at the bottom, he describes the beach and the bay one more time. Down here, once again, he describes the bay as wild. He says he looked over his shoulder at the wild bay. So he's described the bay as wild twice. Then he describes the beach here as he played on the safe beach. So twice he's described the bay as wild, and then he's described the beach as familiar and safe. So the question's asking us, what contrast exists between the beach and the bay? What are the differences? So think about that for a second. Looking at those two lines, those two descriptions he's given, how would you describe the difference between the beach and the bay? Okay, so after thinking about it for a moment, you should have came up with something along the lines of, Jerry's describing the bay as wild, as dangerous, as scary, while the beach is safe, it's comforting, it's familiar, it's not dangerous, it's not scary. So how are we going to go about writing that out in CSRQ format? Complete sentence, restate the question. It's a lot easier than it might seem. So we got to find the actual question in the question, which is right here. Look for those question words. What, who, which, things like that. So we found the word what. What contrast exists between the beach and the bay? So to restate that question, to start out our answer, all we got to do is restate that question. Instead of adding what, though, we can just say the contrast that exists. So we could say, I don't want to underline it, the contrast that exists between the beach and the bay is. So we've taken the question, what contrasts exist between the beach and the bay? And we've simply restated that question by saying the contrast that exists between the beach and the bay. So we're clearly going to answer that question. Okay, we're not leaving anything up to doubt. We're not writing in sentence fragments. We've taken the question and we've restated it in our answer. What contrast exists between the beach and the bay? The answer, the contrast that exists between the beach and the bay is that Jerry sees the bay as something that is dangerous and scary because he describes it as, quote, wild. Oops. On the other hand, the beach, according to Jerry, is something that's safe, familiar. Say safe and familiar. And you're going to want to Obviously, spell check anything that pops up just like that. And that's all you got to do to write in CSRQ format. So instead of writing out our answer in a sentence fragment that maybe doesn't make sense or maybe loses some of the actual question, in translation, we've restated that question to begin so that it's clear. There's no doubt what we're answering, what we're trying to prove, what we're trying to say. So once again, the question, what contrast difference exists between the beach and the bay? After going back through that first paragraph, your answer should look something like this. The contrast that exists between the beach and the bay is that Jerry sees the bay as something that is dangerous and scary because he describes it as wild. On the other hand, the beach, according to Jerry, is something that is safe and familiar. So I hope this helps. I hope this makes sense. If you need any additional help on how to properly set up a CSRQ response, please don't hesitate to ask me. Otherwise, I think you guys got it. Do not forget, though, any of the questions that you respond to without using CSRQ format, you will lose points. It's very important you get into the habit of always answering in CSRQ format anytime I give you a written response type of question. Okay? So if you don't have any other questions, if you've got this, you think you're ready to go, you're set. Get this thing knocked out, get in before the due date expires.